house is not built of just brick and mortar. It is constructed from memories, sealed with love, and maintained by trust. But when trust shatters, the very walls that once protected you can become your living tomb. For Alara Vance, this truth was about to arrive on a quiet Tuesday afternoon, delivered in a crisp, white envelope that felt heavier than it should. Her life, until that moment, was a portrait of serene contentment in suburban Connecticut. At 40, she had cultivated a peaceful existence, pouring her heart into her work as a ceramic artist and into the sprawling rose garden her mother had planted decades ago. The house, a charming colonial with blue shutters, was her sanctuary, the last tangible piece of her parents, a legacy she cherished more than anything. Her 15-year marriage to Marcus was, she believed, the foundation of this piece. He was a successful financial consultant, handsome and articulate, the kind of man who inspired confidence not just in his clients, but in his wife. Even her relationship with her mother-in-law, Beatrice, a woman of sharp edges and quiet disapproval, had settled into a kind of respectful, if distant, truce. The mail arrived just after 3 o'clock. Alara was pruning the heirloom roses, her hands covered in soil, when she saw the letter. It was from a financial institution she had never heard of, Viridian Equity Holdings. Her brow furrowed. They had no loans, no mortgages. The house had been paid off by her father years before he passed. Thinking it was just another aggressive offer for a home equity loan, she almost tossed it into the recycling bin. But something made her pause. She slit the envelope open, her eyes scanning the dense, legal text. Then she saw the words, printed in bold, unforgiving letters, "Notice of foreclosure." The air left her lungs in a silent gasp. The letter stated, in no uncertain terms, that the property was in default on a substantial loan and that foreclosure proceedings had been initiated. It was impossible, a mistake, some ridiculous, cruel administrative error. Her hands trembled as she pulled out her phone and dialed Marcus. When he answered, his voice was the smooth, reassuring baritone she had always loved. She explained the letter, her own voice unsteady, expecting him to laugh it off. He did, but it was a hollow sound. "Oh, that's just junk mail, honey," he said, a little too quickly. "They send those things out all the time to scare people. Don't worry about it. I'll take care of it." But there was a flicker of something in his tone, a tightly wound tension beneath the calm facade. He told her he loved her and had to run to a meeting. Alara ended the call, but the reassurance felt like a thin blanket on a frozen night. She looked at the house, at the walls that held every memory of her life, and for the first time, she felt a stranger's chill. The letter was a mistake. It had to be. But in the pit of her stomach, a cold, hard knot of dread began to form, a premonition that the world she had so carefully built was about to be torn down to its very foundations. Alara's sanctuary was her pottery studio, a converted sunroom at the back of the house where clay dust danced in the afternoon light. Here, she was a creator, a shaper of worlds. She could take a lump of cold, formless earth and, with patience and pressure, transform it into something beautiful and whole. She had long thought of her life in the same way, a vessel she and Marcus were building together, smooth and strong, fired in the kiln of their shared years. But the foreclosure notice sitting on her kitchen counter felt like a fracture, a hairline crack that threatened to shatter the entire piece. Her love for Marcus had always been unconditional, a deep and trusting thing. He was the anchor in her often dreamy, artistic world. While she found meaning in the subtle curves of a vase or the specific glaze of a bowl, Marcus understood the world of numbers, of futures and assets, a language that felt foreign and cold to her. She had entrusted their entire financial world to him willingly, gratefully. It was part of their balance. He handled the complexities of life so she could be free to create. This house was the heart of that life, the silent character in every chapter of her story. It was more than wood and nails. It was a living archive of love. She could walk the halls blindfolded and tell you where the floorboards creaked, a sound her father's heavy footsteps had etched into the wood. She could still smell the ghost of her mother's lavender potpourri in the linen closet, a scent that clung to the memory of childhood hugs. This was the home her parents had bought as young newlyweds, the place they had brought her home to from the hospital, the garden where they had taught her the difference between a weed and a wildflower. Every chipped piece of paint, every sun-faded patch on the wallpaper was a verse in her family's poem, and she was its devoted keeper. When her parents passed away within a year of each other, the grief had been a tidal wave, but the house had been her lifeboat. It was her inheritance, not of money, but of memory, a legacy she intended to honor until her own final days. Marcus had entered her life like a warm summer storm, full of energy and dazzling light. She had been content in her quiet world of art fairs and local galleries, and he was a man who spoke of global markets and 5-year plans. He'd found her at a small exhibition, buying a set of her bowls, and had praised her work with an intensity that made her blush. He said she had an old soul, that her hands understood the earth. He was charming, ambitious, and made her feel seen in a way no one else ever had. He loved the house, or so he said, calling it their forever home, a place with good bones and a beautiful heart. He would often come into her studio while she worked, bringing her coffee, kissing the clay-dusted top of her head, and telling her how brilliant she was. He managed everything. The bills, the taxes, the investments. "You focus on making the world more beautiful, Ilara," he'd say, tapping his temple. "Let me worry about the ugly numbers." She saw it not as control, but as care. It was his way of protecting her, of shouldering the burdens so she could fly. Then there was Beatrice. Marcus's mother was a woman carved from ice, elegant, poised, and perpetually unimpressed. From the beginning, Beatrice had viewed Ilara's artistic career as a charming hobby and her inherited home as a piece of quaint but dated real estate. During their tense Sunday dinners, Beatrice would glide through the rooms, her fingers lightly touching the antique furniture, her praise always carrying a faint sting. "Your mother had such impeccable taste," she once remarked, looking at the dining room table. "It's a mercy that this house is being maintained." The unspoken words hung in the air. "By someone like you." Ilara always tried her best, cooking Beatrice's favorite roast, asking about her charity committees, absorbing the subtle criticisms with a placid smile. She did it for Marcus. She wanted, so desperately, to build a true family, to bridge the gap between her world and his. But with Beatrice, she always felt like an outsider, a temporary curator in a home that wasn't truly hers in the older woman's eyes. Beatrice worshipped her son, speaking of his financial acumen as if he were a king. "Marcus has a gift," she would declare to their friends. "He can create wealth from thin air. He takes care of everything. He takes care of us all." And Ilara would nod in agreement, proud of her capable, brilliant husband. She remembered an evening just a few months ago. She'd found an article about a new, promising ethical investment fund and had brought it to Marcus, thinking he'd be interested. He had glanced at the tablet, a dismissive smile playing on his lips. He took her hand, his touch warm and firm. "Darling, this is sweet, but you can't believe everything you read. The market is a jungle. You need a guide who knows the terrain." He pulled up a colorful chart on his own tablet, a graph that showed a steady, impressive upward climb. "This is us," he said, pointing to the peak. "Secure, safe. I've diversified our assets, made sure we're protected from any volatility. Our future is set. Now, tell me about that new kiln you wanted." He had kissed her, and the conversation was over. She had felt a surge of love and gratitude. He was her protector, her guide. She had put the article, and any fledgling financial curiosity, out of her mind. Now, standing in her kitchen, the memory felt different. It felt slick, rehearsed. The reassuring words, the dazzling chart, the swift change of subject, it was all a part of a grand performance, and she had been the captivated, unsuspecting audience. She looked from the foreclosure notice to a framed wedding photo on the wall. There they were, smiling, radiant with promise. Marcus, the handsome protector. Ilara, the trusting, hopeful bride. But the man in that photo felt like a stranger now, and the woman felt like a fool. The perfect life they had built, the vessel she had thought was so strong, was now revealed to be nothing more than a beautiful, hollow shell, and it was beginning to crumble in her hands. Marcus's reassurances, once the bedrock of her peace, now felt like whispers of smoke, dissipating the moment they left his lips. That evening, he came home bearing a bouquet of her favorite peonies and a story about a triumphant deal he'd closed. He was overly affectionate, his hands finding her waist, his lips, her temple, a performance of marital bliss that was just a little too polished. When she mentioned the letter again, holding it up with a trembling hand, he simply sighed, a theatrical display of patience. He took the letter from her, tore it neatly in half, and then in half again, dropping the pieces into the trash bin. "I told you, Alara, it's handled," he said, his voice a smooth, placating balm. "It was a clerical error. I spent an hour on the phone with some incompetent fool at the bank. It's resolved. Now, can we please forget this unpleasantness and enjoy our evening?" He didn't offer any details, presented no confirmation email, no reference number. He just expected her to accept his word as gospel, as she always had. But for the first time, his word was not enough. The ease with which he dismissed her profound fear was more alarming than the letter itself. That night, Alara lay awake in the dark, listening to the steady, even breathing of the man beside her. Sleep offered no escape. Her mind was a frantic loom, weaving together disconnected threads. Marcus's recent secrecy about his work, his frequent late nights at the office, the expensive new watch she'd seen on his wrist that he'd claimed was a cheap replica. Each memory was re-examined under a new, harsh light. His reassurances echoed in her mind, not as comfort, but as a script. Every word felt chosen, every gesture calculated. The trust she had given him so freely for 15 years had been a blindfold, and now it was beginning to slip. By the time the first gray light of dawn filtered through the blinds, a cold, hard resolve had settled in her chest. The confusion of yesterday had crystallized into a single, terrifying purpose. She needed proof. She needed the truth, on her own terms. When Marcus left for work, kissing her goodbye and telling her to have a relaxing day, she lied to him for the first time in their marriage. "I think I will," she said, her smile feeling brittle and strange on her face. "I might drive over to the city, get some new glazing supplies." It was a small, simple lie, but it felt like a monumental shift, a quiet declaration of war. The drive to the county records office was a journey through a foreign land. The familiar maple-lined streets of her town, the quaint storefronts, the friendly faces, it all looked like a set for a play whose script she no longer knew. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat against the silence in her car. She was caught in a terrible limbo, oscillating between the desperate hope that she was wrong, that this was all a paranoid fantasy, and the gut-wrenching fear that she was right. The government building was a monument to indifference, a sterile cube of concrete and glass. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of old paper and stale coffee. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting a sickly, flat light on everything. She stood in line, her hands clenched so tightly, her knuckles were white, rehearsing the words she would say. When it was her turn, she approached the counter, her voice barely a whisper as she gave the clerk her address. The woman, a middle-aged functionary with tired eyes, typed rhythmically into her computer, her expression unchanging. The minutes stretched into an eternity, each keystroke, each click of the mouse, tightening the knot of dread in Alara's stomach. Finally, the printer in the back whirred to life, spitting out a thick stack of documents. "That'll be $25.50 for the copies," the clerk said, her voice monotone. Alara's hands shook as she took the papers. She moved to a small empty table in the corner, the documents feeling like a lead weight in her hands. She took a deep breath and began to read. The first page was a deed of transfer. Her eyes scanned the legal jargon until they landed on the names. Seller, Alara Vance. Buyer, Northwood Properties, LLC. The name was meaningless, corporate, and cold. A shell. Then she saw the sale price. It was a shockingly low number, less than half of what the house was worth, a figure so far below market value it could only be criminal. Her blood ran cold. She flipped the page and saw the date of the transaction. 6 months ago. 6 months. Her mind reeled. For 6 months, she had been living in a house that wasn't hers. For 6 months, Marcus had kissed her good morning and good night in a home he had secretly stolen from her. Every anniversary dinner, every shared laugh, every promise for the future he'd made in that time was a lie, layered upon this one colossal foundational deceit. And then, at the bottom of the last page, she saw it. The signature, Alara Vance. It was her name, in a script that was an almost perfect imitation of her own. She could see where the forger had mimicked the elegant loop of her E, the sharp upswing of her V. It was a masterful, chilling copy, but it was dead. It lacked the life, the unconscious flow of her own hand. It was a ghost of her identity, a puppet's signature. And the terrible truth landed on her with the force of a physical blow. A stranger could not have done this. This was the work of someone who had sat beside her, watched her sign birthday cards, checks, letters, thousands of times. Someone who had studied her. Someone who had slept in her bed. It was Marcus. It was undeniably, monstrously Marcus. Time seemed to stop. The monotonous buzz of the office faded into a distant hum. The room tilted, the fluorescent lights blurring into streaks. She gripped the edge of the table, the sharp corner digging into her palm, the pain a distant anchor in a sea of shock. This was not just about a house. This was not just about money. He had taken her name, the signature passed down from her father, and had turned it into a weapon against her. He had hollowed out her life, her past, her identity, and sold it for a price she couldn't yet begin to comprehend. The quiet, trusting artist who had walked into this building an hour ago was gone, incinerated in the blaze of this betrayal. In her place sat a woman made of ice and steel, clutching the evidence of her husband's treachery, her world shattered, her mind terrifyingly clear. The drive home was a study in controlled rage. The shock that had paralyzed Alara in the county office had now cooled and hardened into something sharp and dangerous. She drove with meticulous precision, stopping perfectly at every sign, signaling every turn, her movements a stark contrast to the maelstrom inside her. The world outside her car window, once so familiar and comforting, now looked like a facade. The manicured lawns, the smiling neighbors waving as she passed. The very concept of a peaceful suburban life felt like an elaborate, cruel joke. Her own home, as she pulled into the driveway, no longer looked like a sanctuary. It looked like a crime scene. Every window was an eye, every door a closed mouth, guarding a terrible secret. Inside, the silence was heavy, suffocating. She walked to the dining room, the heart of their shared life, the place where they hosted holiday dinners and celebrated birthdays. With deliberate, steady hands, she laid the copies of the documents on the polished mahogany table, arranging them in a neat, undeniable row. The deed of transfer, the fraudulent mortgage agreement, the page with the forged signature placed squarely in the center. Then she sat down in the chair at the head of the table, folded her hands, and waited. Marcus came home just after 6, humming a tune from the radio, his briefcase swinging lightly in his hand. "Honey, I'm home. Something smells amazing, did you?" He stopped short in the doorway of the dining room. He saw her sitting there in the deepening twilight, her face pale and unreadable, her eyes fixed on him. Then his gaze dropped to the table. He saw the papers. For a fraction of a second, a flicker of pure, animal panic crossed his face, so brief that had she blinked, she would have missed it. Then, the mask of the concerned husband slammed back into place. "Alara? What's all this? You look like you've seen a ghost." He walked towards the table, feigning curiosity, his movements slow and cautious. He picked up the top page. "County records? What were you doing there?" "I told you I handled that." "You handled it by lying," Alara said, her voice quiet, devoid of any tremor. It was a cold, flat statement of fact. Marcus let out a short, incredulous laugh. "Lying? Darling, what are you talking about?" He gestured to the papers dismissively. "This is just the paperwork from the refinancing I told you about, to free up some capital for that new investment fund. We discussed it, remember? Over dinner at Giovanni's last spring." Alara stared at him, her heart turning to a stone in her chest. The lie was so audacious, so complete. "We never had that conversation, Marcus, and this isn't a refinancing. This is a deed of sale. You sold my parents' house." He shook his head, his expression shifting to one of profound, wounded concern. He came around the table and tried to put his hands on her shoulders, but she flinched away as if from a hot iron. "Honey, you're not well," he said, his voice dripping with false sympathy. "You've been under so much stress with that big gallery submission. Your memory, it hasn't been the sharpest lately. Remember when you misplaced your car keys for a whole day? Or when you forgot about that dinner with the Hendersons?" He was weaponizing her own life against her, twisting her human moments of forgetfulness into evidence of insanity. This was gaslighting in its purest, most venomous form. "I think you signed these papers, and you've simply forgotten. You were probably distracted. It's okay. But to accuse me of this is insane, Alara. You're scaring me." "Stop it," she whispered, the words barely audible. "Just stop." She pointed a single, trembling finger at the bottom of the page. "I did not write that. That is not my signature." "How can you say that?" he pleaded, his voice rising in manufactured desperation. "After everything I do for us? I manage our entire world so you don't have to worry, and this is the thanks I get? An accusation so vile, so monstrous. You're breaking my heart, Alara. You're truly breaking my heart." He looked for all the world like a man unjustly accused, his eyes shining with unshed tears. For a sickening moment, his performance was so convincing that a sliver of self-doubt pierced her resolve. Could he be right? Could she be losing her mind? Just then, the doorbell chimed, a cheerful, incongruous sound that shattered the tension. Marcus seemed to flinch, his act momentarily faltering. "I'll get it," he said, clearly grateful for the interruption. A moment later, Beatrice's voice echoed from the hallway. "I was just in the neighborhood and baked your favorite lemon drizzle cake." She swept into the dining room, a picture of maternal warmth, holding the cake carrier. But her smile vanished the instant she saw the scene. Her eyes darted from the papers on the table to Alara's rigid posture, to her son's carefully constructed mask of anguish. She didn't need an explanation. She understood immediately. Without missing a beat, she set the cake down and rushed to her son's side, wrapping an arm around him. "Marcus, darling, what's wrong? What has she done to you?" she asked, her voice laced with venom, her gaze fixed on Alara. "She's having one of her episodes, Mother," Marcus said, his voice breaking pathetically. "She's concocted some fantasy that I would ever do anything to hurt her." Beatrice looked at Alara with undisguised contempt. "An episode? This is more than an episode. This is cruelty." She gestured towards the documents. "My son has given you a beautiful life, a life you could never have dreamed of on your own, and this is how you repay him? By dredging up paperwork you don't understand and making these wicked, hysterical accusations." She picked up the deed of sale, her eyes scanning it with cold familiarity. This house was a dead asset, Alara, a sentimental relic. A truly brilliant man, a man like my Marcus, knows how to make assets work for the family's future. He did this for us. For you. The word us hung in the air, a confession in itself. It was the final piece of the puzzle. Alara looked from the husband pretending to be a victim to the mother, pretending to be a protector. She saw the seamless, practiced way they moved together, a two-person army of deceit. This wasn't a spur-of-the-moment lie. This was a conspiracy, and they were both in on it, united against her. The last vestiges of her love and respect for them curdled into pure disgust. There was nothing left to say. There was no explanation to be had, no apology to be given. There was only the ugly, unvarnished truth of their betrayal. Slowly, Alara stood up. She calmly gathered her copies of the documents, her movements precise and unhurried. She didn't look at them. She didn't say a word. She simply turned and walked out of the dining room, leaving them standing there amidst the ruins of their lies, the scent of lemon drizzle cake hanging sickeningly in the air. The silence she left in her wake was her final answer. She was utterly, completely alone. And she was finally, terrifyingly free. The days that followed the confrontation were a masterclass in psychological warfare. The house became a silent, cold theater where Marcus and Beatrice were the lead actors in a play of suffocating normalcy. They spoke to Alara in gentle, condescending tones, treating her as one would a fragile patient recovering from a breakdown. Marcus would leave her little notes. "Thinking of you, my love," as if his treachery had been nothing more than a bad dream she'd had. Beatrice would call with feigned concern, asking if Alara was feeling more herself today. They moved around her with a cloying kindness that was more insulting than any argument. They were trying to build a cage of guilt and self-doubt around her, hoping to convince her that the reality she had uncovered was a symptom of her own instability. But their efforts had the opposite effect. Every false smile, every patronizing touch, chipped away at the last vestiges of the woman she had been, revealing the unyielding bedrock of resolve beneath. Her pottery studio, once a place of creation, became her war room. The clay sat in cold, untouched blocks. The potter's wheel was still. Instead, she sat at her work table for hours. The damning documents spread before her, her mind a whirlwind of strategy. She was an artist, not a detective. She understood color and form, not shell corporations and hidden accounts. The confrontation had confirmed the conspiracy, but it had also revealed the strength of her enemy's alliance. To fight them, she needed more than the truth. She needed irrefutable, crushing evidence of their entire world of lies. She needed a professional. After hours of searching online through encrypted browsers at the local library, she found him, a man named David Davies, a former NYPD detective who ran a discreet private investigation agency. His website was sparse and professional, specializing in complex financial fraud and sensitive domestic matters. His motto was simple: lux in tenebris, light in darkness. Alara made the call. They met in a nondescript coffee shop in a town 30 miles away. The anonymity was a comfort. Mr. Davies was a man in his late 50s with watchful, intelligent eyes that seemed to miss nothing. He didn't offer pity, for which Alara was grateful. He just listened. She laid out the story, her voice low and steady, presenting the documents from the county office as she spoke. She recounted the confrontation, the gaslighting, the seamless way Marcus and his mother had closed ranks against her. Davies listened intently, his expression unchanging, occasionally making a note in a small, leather-bound book. When she was finished, he looked at her for a long moment. "They rarely act alone," he said, his voice a gravelly baritone. "And a betrayal this significant is never about just one thing. When a man is willing to steal the roof over his wife's head, it's because he's already building a new house somewhere else." He told her his fee, a significant sum that would take a large portion of her remaining personal savings. She didn't hesitate. "Find everything," she said, her voice hard as fired ceramic. "I want to know every lie, every secret, every dollar. I want the darkness brought into the light." A week later, Davies requested another meeting at the same location. He slid a thick, brown manila envelope across the table. It landed with a soft, heavy thud that seemed to echo the sinking of Alara's heart. "It's all in there," he said gently. "I have to warn you, it's not pleasant." Alara took the envelope back to her car, her hands unsteady. She couldn't bring herself to open it in public. She drove to a quiet park overlooking a small lake, and, with the engine off, she broke the seal. The first thing she saw were the photographs. High-resolution, full-color images that stole the air from her lungs. There was Marcus, laughing, his head tilted back in a way she hadn't seen in years. His arm was wrapped tightly around the waist of a stunningly beautiful young woman with long, dark hair. They were exiting a boutique hotel, looking like a couple on their honeymoon. Another photo showed them dining on a candlelit terrace, his eyes fixed on her with an expression of pure adoration. He was touching a delicate necklace at her throat, a necklace Alara had never seen before. The pain was a physical blow, a white-hot poker to the chest. This was not just a financial transaction. This was a replacement. Her hands shaking, she turned to the typed report. The woman's name was Sophia Renault. She was 28 years old, a social media influencer and aspiring art curator, a cruel parody of Alara's own life's work. The report detailed a life of obscene luxury, all funded by the equity stolen from Alara's home. There was the lease for a penthouse apartment in the city's most fashionable district, leased not under Marcus's name, but under Northwood Properties, LLC, the same shell company that had bought her house. It was their love nest, paid for with her heritage. The report included copies of Marcus's secret credit card statements, a ledger of his betrayal. There were thousands of dollars spent at Gucci, Chanel, and Cartier. The necklace from the photograph was listed, a Cartier diamond pendant purchased for $15,000, a birthday gift for Sophia. There were charges for a 5-day trip to St. Bart's 2 months ago, a period when Marcus had told her he was attending a grueling financial conference in Chicago. He had called her every night from his hotel, his voice tired, telling her how much he missed her, while he was in fact on a tropical beach with his mistress. The report detailed the money trail, a complex web of transactions designed to obscure the funds. The money from the fraudulent sale had been wired to the LLC's account, then immediately transferred to an offshore account in the Cayman Islands. From there, it was funneled back in smaller, untraceable amounts to fund his secret life. This wasn't an act of desperation. This was a meticulous, long-term plan to liquidate his marriage, to cash out his past so he could invest in a new future. He wasn't just cheating on her, he was erasing her. Alara sat in her car for over an hour, the placid lake outside a blurry backdrop to her inner turmoil. Tears streamed down her face, but they were not the tears of a helpless victim. They were tears of rage and profound grief. Grief for the good man Marcus had never been, grief for the 15 years she had invested in a lie. The betrayal was no longer a matter of forged documents and legal statutes. It now had a name, a face, and a portfolio of lavish expenses. The cold, abstract crime had become a deeply personal wound. She carefully placed the photos and the report back into the envelope. The pain was a fire in her veins, but it was not consuming her. It was forging her. She was no longer just fighting for a house. She was fighting for every memory that had been desecrated, for every moment of love that had been a lie, for the woman she had been, and the woman she would refuse to let them destroy. Closing the envelope was like closing a casket on her old life. The period of discovery was over. The time for justice was about to begin. The pain of the truth was a crucible. For 2 days, Alara barely left her studio. The private investigator's report spread across her work table like a eulogy for her life. She didn't eat. She didn't sleep. She simply stared at the evidence of her husband's monstrous deceit, letting the full weight of it wash over her. She saw Sophia's smiling face, the glittering diamond at her throat, the tropical sunsets in the background, all paid for with the soul of her family home. She saw the intricate web of lies, the offshore accounts, the carefully crafted second life. It was a betrayal so absolute, so profound, that it felt unsurvivable. She hit the bottom of her grief in the darkest hour before dawn on the 3rd day. She was hollow, a vessel emptied of everything she had ever believed in. In the quiet darkness of her studio, she looked up and saw a framed photograph on the shelf, one her father had kept on his desk. It was a picture of her parents on their wedding day, young, proud, and full of fierce optimism. Her father, a man of unshakable integrity, who taught her that a person's name was their most valuable possession. Her mother, a woman of quiet strength, who had cultivated the rose garden as a testament to the fact that beauty could be grown from common soil. Looking at their faces, something inside Alara shifted. The grief, so heavy and suffocating, began to burn, transforming into a cold, clean fury. They had not raised a victim. They had not raised a woman who would allow their legacy to be stripped, sold, and squandered on a cheap affair. Marcus and Beatrice hadn't just stolen from her. They had defiled the memory of her parents. They had underestimated her. They saw her quiet nature as weakness, her trust as naivete. They were about to learn that the deepest passions burn the quietest, and that the silence of a woman who has endured too much is not emptiness, but the drawing of a breath before the storm. Her mission was no longer just to survive. It was to deliver a reckoning. She went to her father's old roll-top desk, the wood still smelling faintly of his pipe tobacco. From a worn leather address book, she found the number for Jonathan Chen, her father's closest friend and longtime lawyer. Making that call felt like the first real act of defiance, a signal that she was no longer alone. "Mr. Chen's law office was a sanctuary of old-world dignity, a stark contrast to the slick, soulless world of Marcus's finances. The rooms were lined with floor-to-ceiling bookshelves filled with legal tomes, the air smelled of lemon oil and aged paper, and the only sounds were the ticking of a grandfather clock and the distant city traffic. Mr. Chen, a sharp and impeccably dressed man in his 70s, greeted her not as a client, but as the daughter of his dearest friend. He embraced her, his eyes full of warmth and concern. "Ilara," he said, his voice kind, "it has been too long. Your father would be so proud of the woman you've become." His words nearly broke her, but she held herself together. They sat in his large leather chairs, and without preamble, she slid the manila envelope across his vast oak desk. "My father taught me to trust my husband," she began, her voice steady. "My husband used that trust to destroy me." For the next hour, she laid out the entire story, her narrative punctuated by the stark evidence in the file. "Mr. Chen listened in absolute silence, his expression growing grimmer with each new revelation. He examined the forged signature on the deed, his jaw tight with anger. He stared at the glossy photographs of Marcus and Sophia, a look of profound disgust on his face. When he read the financial statements, the offshore account details, he let out a low whistle of disbelief. When she finished, he removed his glasses and polished them slowly, his mind clearly working. "The arrogance," he said, his voice a low growl. "The sheer, unmitigated arrogance. To do this to anyone is a crime. To do this to Henry Vance's daughter is a declaration of war." He laid out the legal path forward, his voice crisp and professional. "Legally, the path is clear. We will file for divorce immediately on the grounds of flagrant adultery and financial dissipation. We will file a civil suit against Marcus, his mother, and this shell company to have the sale of your home declared null and void due to fraud. And I will personally deliver this entire file to the district attorney's office. They will face multiple felony charges: grand larceny, forgery, conspiracy to defraud. They will go to prison." He paused, leaning forward, his eyes locking onto hers. "But, Ilara, a legal victory happens in a quiet courtroom. The wheels of justice grind slowly. These people, they built their world on a foundation of reputation and public image. I sense you don't just want restitution, you want justice. And true justice, in a case like this, requires an audience." A new, harder light glinted in his eyes. "Before we fire the first legal shot, we must dismantle their fortress of lies. We will let them believe they have won. We will give them enough rope to hang themselves twice over." It was in that moment that the plan began to form, a strategy not just for legal victory, but for total annihilation of the world Marcus and Beatrice held so dear. Her role, Mr. Chen explained, would be the most difficult. She would have to become the actor of a lifetime. Ilara went home that evening with a fire in her veins and ice in her heart. Her mission was clear. She waited until the next evening, when Beatrice was over for dinner, a weekly ritual that had become an exercise in torture. She found them in the living room, laughing together over a glass of wine. She walked in, her posture slumped, her eyes red-rimmed and downcast. She clutched a handkerchief in her hands. She looked every bit the broken woman they believed her to be. "Marcus, Beatrice," she began, her voice trembling and choked with fake emotion. I need to apologize." They both turned to look at her, their expressions a mixture of surprise and smug satisfaction. "I haven't been myself," she continued, forcing a tear to spill down her cheek. "All the stress from my work. I became paranoid. I imagined the most horrible things. I looked at those papers and my mind just spun out of control." She looked directly at Marcus, her gaze full of manufactured remorse. "I accused you of something monstrous, and I am so sorry. You have only ever taken care of me." Then she turned to Beatrice. "And I was so disrespectful to you. You are my family. Can you both ever forgive me?" A slow, triumphant smile spread across Marcus's face. He strode over and wrapped her in a hug that felt like a snake coiling around her. "Oh, my darling," he purred into her ear. Of course, I forgive you. I knew you would see reason. I told you it was just the stress. Beatrice approached, patting Alara's arm with a condescending pity. There, dear, she said. We all have our moments of weakness. The important thing is, you've come back to reality. You understand now how much Marcus does to protect you. They stood there, a happy family once more, two predators comforting the prey they believed they had successfully subdued. Alara allowed herself to be held, to be patronized, feeling the coldness of their touch through her clothes. She played her part perfectly, the repentant, broken wife. They thought the storm had passed. They had no idea she was the storm, and that the silence they were now enjoying was merely the terrifying, deceptive calm at its very center. Living the lie was the most grueling performance of Alara's life. Each morning, she would wake up next to a man whose touch made her skin crawl, and she would force a gentle smile, asking him if he slept well. She made him his coffee, just the way he liked it, with a single spoonful of raw sugar. She listened to him talk about his day, feigning interest in the stock market and his tedious office politics. The effort was monumental. It took every ounce of her willpower to keep the venom from her voice, to keep the disgust from her eyes. She was an artist, and this was her masterpiece of deception. While Marcus and Beatrice basked in their victory, believing they had successfully pacified the hysterical wife, Alara was moving through her own house like a ghost, a spy in the heart of enemy territory. Her home was no longer a sanctuary. It was a treasure trove of secrets, and she was its patient, meticulous plunderer. Her first target was his home office, a sleek, minimalist room that he called his command center. It was his private kingdom, and she had always respected its boundaries. Now, she saw it for what it was, the place where her life had been dismantled. She waited for a Saturday morning, when Marcus left for his customary 2-hour run, a routine as predictable as the sunrise. This was her window. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she slipped into his chair, the leather cool against her skin. She powered on his laptop. The password screen glowed, a digital gatekeeper. She tried the obvious ones first: their anniversary, his birthday, his mother's name. All were rejected. A bitter, ironic thought struck her. With trembling fingers, she typed Sophia 28. The screen unlocked instantly. The password was his mistress's name and her age. The casual, arrogant cruelty of it took her breath away. For a moment, she felt the urge to throw the machine against the wall, but she forced the feeling down, channeling the rage into focus. She navigated his files, her movements swift and precise. She found what she was looking for in a folder deeply buried in his hard drive, a folder cryptically labeled Projects. It too was password protected. This time she didn't hesitate. She typed, "My new life. Access granted." Inside was the entire blueprint of his betrayal. The real, undoctored financial statements showing the flow of money to the Cayman Islands. Email correspondence with the bank that held the offshore account. Even a draft of a prenuptial agreement between Marcus Vance and Sophia Renault. He had been planning to divorce Alara all along, but only after he had stripped her of everything she owned. Working quickly, her ears straining for the sound of his return, she copied the entire folder onto a tiny USB drive, no bigger than her thumbnail, which she then tucked into the lining of her purse. Her next move was bolder. Marcus often took private calls in the living room, pacing back and forth while he spoke in low, intimate tones. A week earlier, Alara had purchased a small, voice-activated audio recorder online. It was a simple, discreet device. One afternoon, while fluffing the couch pillows, a mundane act of domesticity, she slipped the recorder deep into the crevice beneath the sofa cushions. For 3 days, it sat there, a silent witness. On the 4th evening, after Marcus had gone to bed, she retrieved it. Huddled in her studio, with headphones on, she listened. She fast-forwarded through hours of silence, the muffled sounds of the television, and a few boring business calls. And then, she found it. His voice, but not the one she was used to. This voice was syrupy, intimate, and stripped of all its usual condescension. It was the voice he reserved for Sophia. "No, baby. She doesn't suspect a thing," Marcus was saying, followed by a low chuckle. She completely swallowed the whole story about being stressed and forgetful. It was almost too easy. She's like a little lost puppy, just wants to be told everything is okay. Ilara's stomach churned. Just be patient a little longer, he continued. Once I liquidate the last of the old assets, we're free. The house in the city, the trips, it's all just the beginning, I promise. Our new life is right around the corner. The casual cruelty, the utter lack of remorse, the way he spoke of her as a nuisance to be managed, it was all there, captured in pristine audio. The final bastion was the safe, a steel box hidden behind a bland landscape painting in his office. He had once joked that the combination was the date our real life began. For 15 years, she had naively assumed he meant their wedding anniversary. Now, she knew better. Drawing on the private investigator's report, she spun the dial to the numbers of the date he and Sophia had taken their first trip to Street Bart's. She pulled the handle. The heavy steel door swung open with a soft, satisfying click. Inside, among stacks of financial documents and a few bars of gold, were two items that made her blood run cold. The first was a small, black velvet ring box. She opened it to reveal a magnificent diamond engagement ring, a stone far larger and more brilliant than the modest one he had given her. It was clearly meant for Sophia. The second item was even more damning. It was a manila folder containing several sheets of high-quality paper. On each sheet, her signature, Ilara Vance, was written over and over again in various inks. He had been practicing. Some were clumsy, others nearly perfect. It was a forger's workbook, the irrefutable, physical proof of his cold, calculated crime. This was the smoking gun. At her next meeting with Mr. Chen, she laid her new acquisitions on his desk: the USB drive, the audio recorder, and the forgery practice sheets. As Mr. Chen listened to the recording. His expression hardened into one of cold fury. He examined the practice sheets under a desk lamp, his eyes missing nothing. He looked up at Ilara, and for the first time, she saw a predator's glint in the old lawyer's eyes. "This is it, Ilara," he said, his voice a low, dangerous hum. "This moves beyond a simple, albeit large, case of fraud." His own words prove malice and intent. The practice sheets prove premeditation. The ring proves his motive for the financial crimes. This isn't just a case we can win anymore. With this evidence, we can bury them. He explained how the recording would make any claim of her misunderstanding or instability impossible to defend. He explained how a handwriting expert would use the practice sheets to prove, beyond any doubt, that Marcus was the forger. As she left his office, Ilara felt a strange sense of calm. The gathering of evidence was complete. The psychological toll of the past few weeks had been immense, but each new lie she uncovered had become another stone in the foundation of her resolve. She was no longer the woman who had cried over a foreclosure notice. She was the architect of a meticulous and righteous downfall. That night, at dinner, Marcus told a funny story from work. Ilara laughed, a sound that was light and airy, and for the first time in a long time, the smile that touched her lips was almost real. It was the smile of a hunter who knows her prey is already in the trap, blissfully unaware that the door is about to swing shut. Ilara had assembled a formidable arsenal of evidence. With Mr. Chen's guidance, she had built a legal case against Marcus that was not just strong, but hermetically sealed. They had his premeditation, his motive, his financial trail, and his own damning words on tape. Yet, one nagging detail, a loose thread in the tapestry of his deceit, still bothered Mr. Chen, and by extension, Ilara. The notarization, the old lawyer had said, tapping a perfectly manicured finger on the official seal on the deed of sale. Marcus is a creature of immense ego, but he is not a fool. To get a forged document past a licensed notary public is an incredibly risky crime. The notary would have to log the transaction, verify your identification. For him to pull this off, he either found the most incompetent notary in the state of Connecticut, or this notary was a willing participant. The question hung in the air between them. Did Marcus have another accomplice? The thought was chilling. Ilara contacted the private investigator, Mr. Davies, one last time. The assignment was simple and surgically precise. The notary's name was on the document, Joan Peterson. Ilara wanted to know everything about her. Who was she? Where did she work? And what, if any, was her connection to Marcus or his family? Davies, with his characteristic efficiency, delivered his final report less than 48 hours later. It was a slim file, only a few pages long, but its contents were more explosive than anything that had come before. The first page was a simple background check. Joan Peterson was a registered notary, working independently from a small office in a neighboring town. She had a clean record. The second page, however, contained the missing piece of the puzzle. It was a summary of Joan Peterson's family tree. Her maiden name was Miller, and her mother was the sister of Beatrice Vance's mother. Joan Peterson was Beatrice's first cousin. As Ilara read the name, a fog seemed to lift in her mind, and a memory, trivial and forgotten, rushed back with the force of a physical impact. It was a Tuesday afternoon about 7 months ago. Beatrice had stopped by unannounced, a rare occurrence. She had been unusually warm, almost gushing, complimenting Ilara's pottery, her garden, her dress. The sudden affection had been so out of character that Ilara had felt a vague sense of unease, which she had quickly dismissed as her own cynicism. Beatrice had then produced a large, elaborate greeting card from her purse, the front adorned with a watercolor painting of sunflowers. "Darling," Beatrice had said, her voice syrupy with concern, "my dearest cousin, Joan, has just had a dreadful surgery. She's been so down, and I thought it would lift her spirits to know that we are all thinking of her." She opened the card. Inside, the left panel had a generic printed sentiment. The entire right side, a large expanse of thick, high-quality cardstock, was completely blank. "I was hoping you would sign it as well," Beatrice had cooed, pressing a pen into Ilara's hand. It would mean the world to her to know that Marcus's lovely wife is sending her love. "It shows we are a true family." Ilara, caught off guard and still trying to please her difficult mother-in-law, had readily agreed. "Of course, Beatrice. What should I write?" Beatrice's hand had rested on her shoulder, a gesture that felt less like affection and more like guidance. "Oh, no need for a long message, dear. Her eyesight is poor after the anesthetic. Just a big, lovely signature right here in the middle, so she can see it clearly. Your full, beautiful name, Ilara Vance." Feeling awkward, but wanting to be gracious, Ilara had done exactly as she was told. She had signed her name in the center of the blank white page, the pen Beatrice gave her flowing smoothly across the paper. She remembered thinking it was an odd request, but who was she to question a gesture of kindness for a sick relative? Beatrice had beamed, tucking the card carefully back into her purse. "Thank you, my dear. You have a good heart." Now, sitting with the investigator's report in her hand, the memory replayed in her mind, no longer innocent, but grotesque and horrifying. The sick cousin Joan was Joan Peterson, the notary. The get-well card was a Trojan horse, a brilliantly simple and evil trick to obtain a perfect, authentic signature on what was essentially a blank sheet of paper. Beatrice, with a smile on her face and a lie on her lips, had personally orchestrated the central pillar of the entire fraud. Her son's loving, devoted mother hadn't just encouraged his crime. She hadn't just stood by and watched. She had been an active, willing, and cunning architect of Ilara's downfall. The final pages of Davies's report confirmed it. Phone records showed a dozen calls between Beatrice and her cousin Joan in the week leading up to the sale, and a bank transfer slip showed a payment of $10,000 from Beatrice's personal savings account to Joan Peterson, dated the day after the documents were notarized. The memo line on the transfer read simply, "For your troubles, with love." The depth of the betrayal was staggering. Marcus's actions were born of a selfish, narcissistic greed. He wanted a new life, and he was willing to burn down his old one to get it. But Beatrice's actions were different. They were born of a cold, calculating malice, a contempt for Ilara that ran so deep she was willing to exploit a gesture of human compassion to facilitate a crime. Beatrice had never seen her as a daughter-in-law, or even as a person. She had seen her as an obstacle, a placeholder, a resource to be plundered before being discarded. In that moment, Ilara's plan for justice solidified into something harder and more absolute. This was never just about Marcus. It was about both of them. Beatrice, the matriarch, the puppet master hiding behind a mask of maternal devotion, would not be spared. She would not be allowed to fade into the background as the misguided mother. She would be placed front and center, in the spotlight she so clearly craved, and the world would see her not as a pillar of the community, but as the cruel, common criminal she truly was. Alara carefully filed the new report with the rest of her evidence. The conspiracy was now fully illuminated, every dark corner exposed. The trap was no longer set for one, it was set for two. The time for gathering secrets was over. The time for setting the stage had arrived. Alara, with the cold precision of a master strategist, began to orchestrate the final act. She chose the occasion with a sense of poetic irony. Their 16th wedding anniversary. She approached Marcus one evening, her eyes full of the soft, penitent light she had perfected over the past few weeks. "Darling," she began, her voice a gentle murmur, "I know I've been difficult, but I am so grateful for your patience, for our marriage. I want to celebrate us. I want to book a table at the Gilded Lantern and invite the Abernathys, just our closest friends, to celebrate 16 years. I want everyone to see how strong we are, how we've moved past my foolishness." Marcus's ego, already inflated by his perceived victory over his wife's episode, swelled to a breaking point. A grand public celebration where he and his mother would be the center of attention, with his now docile wife playing her proper, adoring role. It was perfect. "That's a wonderful idea, my love," he said, beaming. "A truly wonderful idea. I'll call them myself." Beatrice was equally delighted, seeing it as the ultimate confirmation of her son's control and her own matriarchal triumph. They were walking into the trap with gleeful, arrogant blindness. The Gilded Lantern was the perfect venue. It was a hushed cathedral of fine dining, a place where the town's elite came to see and be seen. A whisper in this restaurant became a headline in the country club by the next morning. It was a stage designed for maximum social impact. But Alara's plan had another, more volatile element. Humiliating Marcus and Beatrice was one thing, but to truly dismantle Marcus's world, she needed to detonate his new life at the same time as his old one. She needed Sophia. Inviting her was impossible, so Alara devised a more elegant and cruel solution. A few days before the dinner, she booked a second, much smaller reservation at the same restaurant. A secluded, romantic table for two, set for 9 o'clock, an hour after their main party was scheduled to begin. That evening, she presented it to Marcus. After the others leave, she whispered, "I've arranged for a special table just for us, so we can have a private moment to celebrate." Marcus was thrilled by her romantic foresight. He didn't know that Alara had also purchased a burner phone. The day of the dinner, a single, anonymous text message was sent to Sophia Renault. "If you want to see the future, Marcus is promising you. Be at the Gilded Lantern at 9 p.m. He has a table for two waiting. It's time he finally introduced you as the real woman in his life." The bait was irresistible. For a young woman like Sophia, who had been a secret for so long, the idea that Marcus was finally ready to publicly claim her at such an exclusive venue would be a dream come true. She would be there, dressed to kill, expecting a triumphant reveal. The evening of the anniversary arrived, cloaked in a deceptive calm. Alara wore a simple, elegant black dress, a stark contrast to Beatrice's jewel-encrusted gown. Marcus was the epitome of the charming, successful husband, greeting their friends, the Abernathys, with warm handshakes and expensive champagne. He and Beatrice held court at the center table, soaking in the admiration, completely oblivious. Alara played her part with an Oscar-worthy performance. She smiled, laughed at their jokes, and placed a loving hand on her husband's arm at all the right moments. From the outside, they were a portrait of marital bliss and enduring power. Friends and acquaintances would stop by the table. 16 years. "Congratulations, you two," they would say. "You're an inspiration." And Marcus would puff out his chest while Beatrice would nod regally as if accepting a well-deserved tribute. Alara would simply smile and say, "I'm the luckiest woman in the world." As the main courses were cleared away and the dessert menus were offered, Alara knew it was time. She stood, her movements graceful and unhurried, and gently tapped her water glass with a spoon. The soft chime cut through the restaurant's low hum, and the table fell silent. "If I could have your attention for just a moment," she said, her voice clear and steady, carrying a new, unfamiliar authority. "I'd like to propose a toast." Marcus and Beatrice beamed, ready to receive her public adoration. "I want to toast my husband, Marcus, on our 16th anniversary." She raised her glass to him, her eyes locking onto his. 16 years. It's a long time. A time for building a life, a future, and most importantly, for building trust. A slight shadow passed over Marcus's face at the emphasis in her tone, but he kept his smile fixed. "And I've learned so much about trust in these past months," Alara continued, her voice growing colder, sharper. "I've learned about financial trust and the profound importance of certain assets, like, for instance, a house that has been in a family for generations, an asset that holds memories, not just monetary value." Beatrice's smile tightened at the edges. The Abernathys looked at each other, confused. "I've also learned about marital trust," Alara went on, her gaze unwavering, "and the vital importance of transparency between a husband and a wife, of not having secrets." The air at the table was now thick, with a tense, unspoken dread. Marcus's face had paled. "You've always told me you were a master of planning for the future, Marcus. You called it building our new life," she said, her voice dropping to a near whisper. "So tonight, as my special anniversary gift to you and to your wonderful mother who has helped you so much, I thought we could all take a look at the incredible new life you have both been building without me." As the last word left her lips, she gave a subtle nod to a man in a dark suit standing discreetly near the restaurant's bar. He was an audio-visual technician she had hired for the evening. He pressed a button on a small remote. Across the room, the large, ornate screen on the wall, which had been displaying a rotating gallery of classical paintings, flickered and went black. Every head at the table, and many from the surrounding tables, turned to look. Marcus and Beatrice sat frozen, their faces masks of dawning horror. The performance was over. The trial was about to begin. The black screen held the entire restaurant captive. For a few agonizing seconds, the only sound was the faint clinking of cutlery from distant, oblivious tables. Marcus and Beatrice stared at the blank monolith, their faces etched with a dawning dread. "Mrs. Abernathy leaned forward, whispering, "Alara, what on earth is this?" Alara didn't answer. She simply took a small step back from the table, giving everyone a clear view, a silent master of ceremonies, letting her production speak for itself. Then, the screen flickered to life. The first image was a breathtaking photograph of a tropical sunset, the sky a blaze of orange and purple. In the foreground, silhouetted against the light, were two figures. As the image sharpened, a collective gasp rippled through the room. It was Marcus, his arm wrapped around a beautiful young woman in a flowing white dress. He was kissing her temple, his eyes closed in an expression of pure bliss. The image dissolved, replaced by another. Marcus and the same woman, Sophia, laughing on the deck of a yacht, champagne glasses in hand. Then another. This one, an intimate shot of them at a candlelit dinner, his hand caressing her cheek. A slow, mournful piano sonata began to play, a soundtrack to his infidelity. The Abernathys and the other guests stared, their faces a mixture of shock and embarrassment, pointedly avoiding looking at Alara, as if her humiliation were contagious. Marcus's face had gone a ghastly white. He looked as if all the air had been punched out of him. The slideshow of his affair faded to black, and a new horror began. An audio file waveform appeared on the screen, and his own voice, smooth and treacherous, filled the silent restaurant. "No, baby, she doesn't suspect a thing." The recording of his phone call with Sophia began. The patrons at nearby tables fell silent, turning to stare. She completely swallowed the whole story about being stressed and forgetful. It was almost too easy. She's like a little lost puppy, just wants to be told everything is okay. Beatrice's hand flew to her mouth, her eyes wide with panic. She shot a venomous glare at Alara, who stood unmoved, her expression as serene as a marble statue. The recording continued, detailing his promises to Sophia, his contempt for the life he was leading, his excitement for their new life. When the audio ended, the the screen changed again, this time to something that looked like a corporate presentation. A simple, brutal flowchart appeared. At the top, a picture of Alara's family home, labeled The Asset. An arrow pointed down to the logo of a shell company, Northwood Properties, LLC, with the fraudulent sale price of $800,000 displayed in stark red numbers. Another arrow showed the money moving to an offshore bank in the Cayman Islands. From there, arrows branched out, pointing to copies of credit card statements. The expenses were listed in a scrolling column of shame: Cartier bracelet, gift for SR, $15,000. Penthouse apartment lease deposit, $30,000. First-class tickets to Street Barts, $22,000. Dinner at Le Cirque, $1,800. The methodical, visual evidence of his theft was undeniable. He hadn't just cheated, he had plundered. The next image was the knockout blow. On the left side of the screen was a scanned copy of Alara's driver's license, showing her true, fluid signature. On the right was a close-up of the forged signature on the deed of sale. Even to an untrained eye, the differences were now glaring. And then, the final, damning image appeared. A high-resolution photograph of the practice sheets from the safe, showing his repeated, clumsy attempts to copy her name. Ilara Vance, Ilara Vance, Ilara Vance, was written over and over, a testament to his cold, premeditated crime. Mr. Abernathy, a CEO who lived and died by the sanctity of a contract, audibly gasped and pushed his chair back from the table, as if to distance himself from the filth. Finally, the presentation turned its merciless eye on Beatrice. A smiling photograph of her appeared, arm in arm with another woman at a garden party. The caption read, "Beatrice Vance and her cousin, Notary Public Joan Peterson." Below it, a copy of the bank transfer slip for $10,000 from Beatrice to Joan flashed on the screen. As if on cue, a pre-recorded voiceover began to play. It was Alara's voice, calm, clear, and devastating. To legitimize the forgery, her voice explained to the Wrapped restaurant, "My mother-in-law used a sick relative as a ruse, tricking me into signing my name on a get-well card, which was, in fact, a blank document. She turned an act of compassion into an instrument of fraud." Beatrice let out a strangled cry, her carefully constructed facade of aristocratic dignity finally shattering, revealing the snarling, cornered creature beneath. It was at this precise moment of peak devastation, with the evidence of Beatrice's crime lingering on the screen, that the grand doors of the Gilded Lantern swung open. Framed in the doorway stood Sophia Renaud. She was a vision in a scarlet dress, her hair and makeup flawless. A triumphant, expectant smile was on her face as she scanned the room, searching for her benefactor. Her eyes found the table. She saw the horrified faces of the guests. She saw Beatrice, pale and trembling. She saw Marcus, a man utterly broken, his face buried in his hands. And then she saw the giant screen behind them, saw the photos of herself, the bank statements, the entire sordid story of her affair laid bare for the world to see. Her smile did not just fade. It collapsed, replaced by a mask of pure, unadulterated horror. She had not arrived for a coronation. She had arrived at a public execution, only to discover she was one of the condemned. The room was a tableau of ruin: the disgraced husband, the exposed matriarch, the shocked mistress. And in the center of it all stood Alara. She calmly picked up her untouched glass of champagne. Every eye in the restaurant was on her. She looked directly at her weeping, shattered husband. "Happy anniversary, Marcus," she said, her voice cutting through the silence like glass. She then flicked her eyes towards the frozen figure of Sophia by the door. "And for your romantic 9 o'clock reservation," she added, a chillingly pleasant smile on her lips. "It seems your guest of honor has arrived right on time." She took a single, slow sip of her champagne, the taste of victory crisp and cold on her tongue. The silence that followed was absolute, a deafening void filled only by the wreckage of 2 ruined lives. The sip of champagne was like a final, punctuation mark at the end of a long and terrible sentence. For a moment, the entire restaurant seemed to be holding its collective breath, trapped in the amber of Alara's cold, triumphant gaze. The silence was the most profound sound she had ever heard, a vacuum filled with the wreckage of reputations and the ghosts of 1,000 lies. It was broken, not by a shout, but by the sharp, metallic clatter of a fork dropping from Mrs. Abernathy's nerveless hand onto her plate. The small sound was like a starting pistol. The spell was shattered. Chaos erupted. A wave of frantic whispers swept through the room, rising in volume until it was a roaring wave of scandal. Smartphone screens, which had been glowing discreetly, were now held up openly, their small red recording lights blinking like malevolent eyes, capturing every delicious, horrifying detail. The Abernathys were the first to flee. Mr. Abernathy, his face flushed with a mixture of anger and acute embarrassment, threw his napkin onto the table and stood up so abruptly his chair nearly toppled over. He grabbed his wife's arm, muttering, "We're leaving. Now." He didn't look at Marcus or Beatrice. He simply steered his mortified wife towards the exit, a clear and public act of social amputation. They were the first rats to desert the sinking, gilded ship. Sophia, still frozen by the doorway, was the next to break. Her beautiful face, which had arrived flushed with triumphant expectation, was now a pale, contorted mask of panic. Her eyes darted from the incriminating images on the screen to the pathetic, crumbling figure of Marcus, and in that instant, she saw her future, the penthouse, the Cartier diamonds, the endless luxury evaporate into thin air. He was no longer a powerful, wealthy benefactor. He was a social pariah, a criminal about to be consumed by his own downfall. She was a pragmatist. Without a word, without a single glance back, she turned on her heel and vanished back into the night, a silent, scarlet ghost abandoning the scene of the crash. The new life Marcus had promised her had lasted for all of 90 seconds in the public eye. Beatrice, however, was not a pragmatist. She was a cornered queen, and her only instinct was to attack. The shock on her face curdled into pure, unadulterated rage. "You!" she shrieked, her voice cracking the restaurant's hushed atmosphere. She lunged to her feet, knocking over a glass of red wine that bled across the white tablecloth like a fresh wound. "You ungrateful little witch, after everything my son has given you, everything we have done for you, you were nothing before him." Her tirade was a spectacle of impotent fury, her words only serving to confirm the cruelty Elara's presentation had so coolly outlined. She was no longer a regal matriarch. She was just a loud, bitter woman, stripped of her dignity. Marcus, in contrast, seemed to have imploded. He remained slumped in his chair, his head in his hands, utterly destroyed. He finally looked up at Elara, his eyes red-rimmed and pleading. The arrogance was gone, replaced by a desperate, pathetic whimper. "Elara, why?" he choked out. "Please, you didn't have to do this." It wasn't an apology. It wasn't an admission of guilt. It was the complaint of a man who was not sorry for the crime, but simply for being caught. Elara said nothing. She watched them, her expression unreadable, her heart a cold, still stone in her chest. She had unleashed the truth, and the truth was now consuming them like a fire. It needed no further help from her. Just as Beatrice opened her mouth to launch another volley of insults, two men, in dark, conservative suits, appeared at the head of the table, their presence instantly commanding attention. They were flanked by the calm, imposing figure of Mr. Chen. The chaos in the restaurant immediately hushed. "Marcus Vance? Beatrice Vance?" the taller of the two men said, his voice quiet, but carrying an unmistakable weight of authority. "We are detectives with the Connecticut State Police Financial Crimes Unit." He held up his badge. "You are both under arrest." Beatrice let out a strangled gasp. Marcus simply stared, his mouth hanging open, a broken statue. The second detective moved behind Marcus, taking his hands to cuff them behind his back. The sharp, metallic click of the handcuffs was the loudest sound in the room. Beatrice began to struggle as the other detective approached her. "Get your hands off me," she hissed. "Do you have any idea who I am?" "Yes, ma'am, we do," the detective said, his voice bored and unimpressed as he efficiently secured her wrists. "You have the right to remain silent." The ignominy was absolute. Marcus and Beatrice Vance, the pillars of their community, were being arrested for fraud in the middle of the Gilded Lantern, in front of everyone they had ever tried to impress. They were escorted out, a pair of common criminals, their path lit by the flash of 100 cell phone cameras. The public, who had moments ago been their audience, had now become their jury and their executioners. The detectives, Mr. Chen, and the disgraced Vances were gone. The restaurant staff was trying in vain to restore order. The Abernathyses' table was empty. Sophia was gone. Ilara was left alone at the center of the wreckage. The adrenaline that had sustained her for weeks, for this one night, drained away, leaving behind a vast, hollow emptiness. There was no surge of joy, no sweet taste of victory. She had expected to feel triumphant, or at least relieved. Instead, she felt quiet. It was the quiet of a battlefield after the war is over, the ground littered with casualties. She had won. She had taken back her life and her name. But the cost had been immense. To achieve justice, she had been forced to become a warrior, a strategist, an actor, an executioner. She had been forced to destroy the entire world she had once loved. The justice she had achieved was not a warm and healing light, but a cold, sterile, and necessary fire that had burned everything to the ground, leaving only her, standing alone in the ashes. Mr. Chen returned and stood quietly by her side. "It's done, Ilara," he said softly. She looked down at her left hand, at the simple gold band on her finger. For 16 years, it had been a symbol of a promise, of a partnership, of love. Now, it was nothing but a relic of a colossal lie. With slow, deliberate fingers, she pulled the ring off. It felt strangely light. She placed it carefully on the table, next to the bill for their final disastrous supper. Then she stood up, turned her back on the whispers and the wreckage, and walked out of the restaurant, leaving her old life behind for good. The trial, when it came, was less a dramatic contest and more a cold, methodical autopsy of a crime. Faced with the mountain of irrefutable evidence, the audio recordings, the financial trail, the forgery practice sheets, and the damning video from the Gilded Lantern, which had since gone viral, Marcus and Beatrice's high-priced lawyers could do little more than plead for mercy. The jury's deliberation was a mere formality. The verdict was guilty on all counts: grand larceny, conspiracy to defraud, and forgery. At the sentencing, the judge looked down at Marcus and Beatrice, his expression devoid of sympathy. "You did not steal from a stranger," he said, his voice echoing in the silent courtroom. "You preyed upon the deepest bonds of trust, that of a husband to his wife and a mother to the woman her son chose. You weaponized love and family for greed. It is a betrayal of the most depraved kind." Marcus was sentenced to 8 to 10 years in state prison. Beatrice, due to her role as a primary conspirator, received a sentence of 5 to 7. The legal victory was absolute, but the true consequences played out in the silent, lonely spaces beyond the courtroom. In prison, Marcus tried desperately to cling to the wreckage of his new life, placing collect calls to Sophia. After the third attempt, he was met with the sterile, automated message: "The number you have dialed has been disconnected." A week later, he was served with divorce papers in his cell. The legal documents, filed by Mr. Chen, were brutal in their efficiency, stripping him of any claim to their former life. He had sold his wife's past for a future with a woman who had valued him only for his wallet. Now, with the money gone and his freedom forfeit, he had nothing. His new life was a 6 by 8 foot cell, his future a monotonous stretch of regret. For Beatrice, the final, most devastating blow came during the asset forfeiture hearings related to the divorce. As Mr. Chen's forensic accountants presented their findings to the court, detailing how Marcus's assets should be liquidated to repay Ilara, they uncovered a second, secret stream of illicit income. For nearly 5 years, Marcus had been systematically siphoning funds from his mother's retirement accounts, using a power of attorney she had trustingly granted him to make small, untraceable withdrawals that amounted to hundreds of thousands of dollars. He had been stealing from her all along. Beatrice was present in the courtroom, listening via a video link from the correctional facility. As Mr. Chen laid out the evidence of this ultimate betrayal, her face, which had been a mask of defiant anger, simply crumbled. The son for whom she had sacrificed everything, her reputation, her freedom, her moral compass, had been bleeding her dry while smiling to her face. The cause she had championed was a lie. Her perfect, brilliant son was nothing but a parasite who had fed on the two women who loved him most. In that moment, Beatrice Vance, the proud matriarch, was utterly and completely broken. She didn't cry or scream. She simply went silent, her eyes vacant, her soul seemingly extinguished. That was her true life sentence. Elara was granted full restitution. The fraudulent sale of her home was officially voided, the title returned to her name, clear and unencumbered. For the first time in almost a year, she walked up the familiar stone path, the key feeling heavy and foreign in her hand. The house was the same, yet entirely different. At first, every room felt haunted by the ghosts of the lies that had been told within its walls. The dining room where they had confronted her, the living room where he had taken his secret calls, the bedroom they had shared. The memories were a poison. Her first instinct was to sell it, to walk away and never look back. But then, she walked into the garden. The roses, neglected during the months of turmoil, were struggling, choked by weeds. Yet, they were still alive. She knelt in the soil, her hands touching the earth, and felt a connection not to the betrayal, but to the legacy of her mother, to the strength of her father. To abandon this house would be to let them have the last word. It would be allowing their stain to erase her history. And so, she stayed. She began the slow, deliberate work of reclaiming her life by reclaiming her home. She hired painters to cover the walls in new, vibrant colors. She had the floors sanded down, erasing the paths her enemies had walked. She moved the furniture, breaking the spell of the old arrangements. Her pottery studio, once her war room, became a place of creation again. Her hands, which had trembled with rage and grief, now steadily shaped new and beautiful things from the clay. Most importantly, she tended to the garden. She pulled the weeds, pruned the dead branches, and nurtured the roses back to health. As new buds began to form, she felt her own spirit healing with them. The house was no longer a crime scene. It was a fortress of her own making, a testament to her resilience. They had mistaken her silence for weakness, her patience for acceptance. They had forgotten the most fundamental truth about human nature. You should never, ever underestimate the silence of a person who has endured for too long, because when they finally decide to act, their voice is not a plea, but a reckoning. Elara was alone now, but for the first time in her life, she was not lonely. She was whole. She was free. And in the quiet of her garden, surrounded by the blooming roses of her mother's legacy, she was finally home. Thank you for listening to our story. We invite you to join us again next week for another tale of family, betrayal, and the unshakable pursuit of justice.